Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals who help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your media, your way.
All right, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to session 2 of our September Sankofa seminar. 3 S's. A little alliteration this morning on Nigerian history from 1000 CE to 1800 CE. We've got a lot of information to share with you today. A lot of it is going to be focused on Southwest and Central Nigeria. So we're going to jump right in it. Last week, we talked about the importance of the sources that we use to reconstruct this history. We talked about the importance of Ile Ife. Daniel walked us through that history, and we're going to continue on that path, looking at kingdoms in Southwest and Central Nigeria that have a connection to Ile Ife. And we're not just going to look at this in historical isolation, as if what happened during the time period that we're talking about has no effect on what's going on today in 2022. We're going to get into why it's important to know this history to understand what's going on in that region today, at least among traditional rulers who are still active, who have lineages that go back to this time period. Second thing we're going to do, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel, and we're going to talk about the sources that we use when we talk about kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Benin, which is really important for you to understand this early, because for a lot of my time as a scholar, actually, I used to confuse this a lot. But the Kingdom of Benin that we're going to talk about today is not in the country of Benin. That was the Kingdom of Dahomey. And speaking of that kingdom, last night, my wife and I saw that movie, The Woman King. And I've been talking to some folks that are actually here today we got, one guest here today in the audience. Brother Robin is here. And speaking of that, we encourage everybody to start coming again in person. We're going to try to recreate that vibe that we used to have down at the Bronson Center and even at the elementary school before the pandemic. So maybe not this seminar, but definitely our Shiro seminar in October. Come on out. We'll be here. We can have discussions and possibly some food if that'll drive y'all out, and we'll have that together. So, but anyway, we were talking about that movie that came out last night with Viola Davis. It's worth seeing. It's not a documentary, so don't think that it's completely historically accurate, but it's good historical fiction. They take an institution, the Minon, the elite female soldiers of the Kingdom of Dahomey, and it tells this particular story around the time of the slave trade and the inter-African interactions between different African kingdoms, how those kingdoms interacted with Europeans, how those sisters fought. It tells a great story. It's well directed by the sister actually that directed Love and Basketball. If you like that movie, you'll love this movie. And I'm not getting paid by the movie people to talk about it like this, but it's really good. And I encourage everybody to check it out. But anyway, that is set in the Kingdom of Dahomey, which is now the modern country of Benin. The Benin Kingdom that we're talking about today is in Nigeria. It's in south central Nigeria. It's probably central Nigeria is what we're getting at today. So we're going to talk about the sources and evidence that we have for this period for the Oyo Kingdom, as well as the Kingdom of Benin. And then we're going to talk about some of the major events, cultural practice, and key personalities, rulers and others who operated in these kingdoms between the years 1000 CE and 1600 CE. Really important time period that we're talking about. And it's my only small critique. And it's not even really a critique of the movie, because the movie, like I said, was great. But it's good that that movie came out to tell a different type of story of Africa, but it still had a tangential connection to the European slave trade. And when me and Daniel were creating this seminar, one of the things that we were expressly, what we desired to do was to talk about African history without talking about the slave trade or Arab imperialism at all, because so much of African history has nothing to do with the slave trade. It has nothing to do with Arab imperialism. So it's important for us to tell those stories as well. You don't have to make a story about African people that has something to do with the slave trade. Great movie, but that's my only small critique of Hollywood sometimes. We can tell we got 90% of African history that has nothing to do with Europeans. So we should tap into some of those stories and put those on film as well. But anyway, this is what our objectives are today. The course website is being updated. All of you who have registered for the course via Zoom, I'm going to share that with you this afternoon. So you'll have access to the recordings as well as some resources that talk about the various histories that we're bringing up, so you can read this information for yourselves. That's a living website, so it's going to be constantly growing with new recordings, new videos, new sources, and possibly some quizzes and activities that you can utilize to make sure that you really absorb the information that we're talking about. So let's go to the modern day, 2022. The history that you're going to learn about today is connected to contemporary rulers, traditional rulers in Nigeria that are still operating, that still hold power over people, spiritual power, political power. They have political influence, much more so than that woman that just died in England. So it's important for you to know these folks, and not just what's going on with the Windsors. We know more about the colonizers and their family and their kids and this princess and that duke and this and all this than we know about sitting African traditional rulers that have sway over millions of people, tens of millions of people in different parts of Africa, not just Nigeria, but even in Uganda, with Swaziland, Ghana, other places that have traditional rulers, Benin, the Republic of Benin, etc. So right now, the current sitting Oni of Ife is Oba, and Oba means king, Oba Ogunwusi, who became the Oni of Ifa in 2015. At the age of 40, he was a really young traditional ruler when he became the Oni of Ife in 2015. One of the other rulers who is, I'll say he's paramount to him, and we'll get into what that means in a second. But the Ilake of Egbaland, Oba Badebo, who's been Oba since 2005. And then the Benin Kingdom, you got Oba Iwore II, who started reigning in 2016. So these are some of the current traditional rulers in Nigeria. And a couple of years ago, actually, right before the Oba of Benin took over in 2016, there was a little kerfuffle, a little argument between the Oba, that at the time the Oba of Benin, Oba Eret, and my Edo in Yoruba is not as strong as it needs to be. Daniel is much better at it than me. But the Oba of Benin at the time, who passed away in 2016, got into it with the Oni of Ife because of some comments made by the Eleke of Egbaland. Back in 2016, the Eleke of Egbaland was honoring the newly installed Oni of Ife. And he made these statements. He said, "You're paramount among us, among all the Obas of Yorubaland, since you're the Oni of Ile-Ife." And we talked about last week the importance of Ife to Yoruba people. So he said, "You're paramount. The Alafin of the Oyo Kingdom is number 2. And right now, there is no Alafin of Oyo right now. The last one died in April. I think he was in his 80s, or older man. He died in April. And they're in the process, right as we speak, of choosing another one. The Oyo Messi, or the kingmakers of the Oyo Kingdom, are narrowing down the candidates. It's something that it's not hereditary. It doesn't just go from father to son. So you saw how when that lady died in England, that her son Charles took over. Just automatic. They had the little process. It's not the same in these kingdoms. There are kingmakers that come together. They choose among the candidates, and there could be hundreds of candidates. In this case, they took it from, I think last report I read, it was about from 65 to 10. And from that 10, it will be the new Alafin of Oyo Kingdom will be chosen. And it's not just human beings making this decision, for lack of a better term, but they will also consult Ifa. Ifa is a divination system, a divination science. It's a way of tapping into God's knowledge. It's the best way to describe it. I can't really describe it in English terms, but it's a way of tapping into God's knowledge. And they consult Ifa to figure out who's going to be the next elephant of oil. And that process is ongoing. And there was some controversy a couple of weeks ago because somebody said people are paying $200,000 to be on the list and all types of other stuff going on. But the Oyo Messe, the kingmaker, say, no, that's not true. That's not what's going on. But anyway, there's no elephant of oil right now. So according to the Eleke of Egbaland, the Oni of Ife is number 1. The elephant of oil is number 2. Then the Oba of Benin is number 3. And he, being the Oba of Egbaland, is number 4 on the list in terms of who has hierarchy in Yoruba land. Well, the people in Benin Kingdom took exception to this because their understanding of history is a little bit different than what the Eleke of Egbaland is saying. And a lot of this stems from a book that was written by the last, the previous Oba of Benin before he passed away. He wrote this autobiography called I Remain, Sir, Your Obedient Servant. Talks about his life because these Obas, they had lives before they become traditional rulers. Some of them worked in government. A lot of them, have college degrees. They got trained in the UK and the West. He was involved in the military government before he became the Oba. He was a very influential figure in Nigerian politics before he became Oba of Benin. But he writes his autobiography and he sets out a lineage of the Obas of Benin that's different than what the Oni of Ife and the Eleke of Egbaland and the Alafin of Oyo say. So the Kingdom of Benin says we're not underneath the Oni of Ife, the rest of the Yoruba, because the people in Benin aren't even really Yoruba. They're Edo. It's a different ethnic group, different language. It's related, but it's different. So this is where the controversy came out in 2016, where the Oni of Ife said, we in Oduduwa land, which is the land that was settled by Oduduwa, we talked about that last week, Ife, have always seen and regarded our people, and our being, they're my people, not just, we're not related, but I'm over them, in Benin Kingdom as part and parcel of Oduduwa House. They are our brothers and sisters, coupled with historical facts to back up this position. Well, one of the representatives of the Kingdom of Benin, Chief David Edebere, speaking on behalf of the Kingdom of Benin, says there's no basis for such classification. Oba of Benin has nothing to do with the Yoruba Obas. It is simply unnecessary unless they simply want to stir up unnecessary controversy. We are not in Yoruba land. To be frank, it is because many of them are not willing to come up with the truth. The word Oba is alien to Yoruba monarchy. It is not a part of their title from time immemorial. And he points out that they call themselves Oni and Alakes. They don't even call themselves Oba until recent times. That's what he's saying. That's his historical argument. He goes on to say, our traditional history says that the Oni of Ife was a Benin prince who wandered from here to Ife, settled there, and became the ruler there. That is the position. If they do not know, they should send people here and we will teach them. We will show them landmarks. So this is unnecessary. So this is unnecessary misrepresentation of history. Maybe the Alake wanted to mention a different place and not Benin. So, and this man, David Edebere, is one of the great Nigerian nationalists. He's in his 90s right now. I think he's 93 years old. Still active. He was a lawyer. He is a guardian of Edo culture and of the history of the Benin Kingdom. So he speaks with some authority. And he's also the head of a very important spiritual function among the Benin Kingdom in that he has the power to oversee people that, or he's tasked with monitoring people that try to use spirituality to do harm to other people. In the West, they call those people witches. And in different places, they call them different things. But there are people that try to manipulate the spiritual world to harm people. And his job is to protect people from that. and to find out if people are practicing like that and to rehabilitate those people. And he writes in an article I read recently that back in the day, they used to kill people that did stuff like that. But now, and we were right before this session started, I was talking to Brother Robin about restorative justice practices. They don't kill witches anymore. They try to rehabilitate these people so they can stop trying to use spirituality to hurt people. So that's his role. He's in charge of all the people that are the spiritual police that go out and try to get people that are practicing witchcraft. So this is his position. So we're seeing how the history of this time period, because all this stuff stems from the time period that we're talking about, is still affecting folks in 2022. So as I turn it over to Daniel, who's going to give you possibly an answer to this controversy, the controversy stemming from were the originators of the Benin Kingdom migrants from Ife, or was Ife established by migrants from Benin? Because that plays a role in 2022 of who is paramount. Is it the Oni of Ife, or is it the Oba of Benin? So hopefully, by listening to what's presented today and hearing about some more personalities that we'll talk about, there might be an answer to this. It might be something we could find in the historical record. The only way to know that is to study the historical record. So I'm going to turn it over to Daniel because he is the subject expert on this part of Nigeria for our seminar. And please listen to him. And then we'll take a break in the middle. Then we'll come back and you'll hear some more from Daniel as well. So Daniel, go ahead. Daniel, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry.
Caladirhan is uninterested in going back to his country of birth. He felt like his father rejected him, and at this point, he wants nothing more to do with them. So he ends up sending messengers to Ukhaton multiple times. And Ikaladirhan gets so annoyed with this that he starts lining his village with ditches so that every time that a delegation comes, they'd fall into the ditches and they would die. So that way there's nobody able to successfully get to him. So at this point, the elders who would have made him the next Ogiso decided that the trouble he was giving the king's messengers wasn't worth the effort to try to talk to him. So Ogiso Oworo ended up dying without an heir, without any more children, because his wives were still barren at this time. And so he died without an heir, and there was a need for a new king to rule over the country. So after Oworo's death, there's a brief interregnum. At this point, there was a temporary rule of a man named Evian. He didn't belong to the royal lineage, but he happened to take over the throne at this time. He was the most important man in Igoro Migoro during the reign of the Ugiso. And this he's known for being a hero because during Oworo's reign, there was a monster that the Edo people call Oshogan, who was said to have come from the sky and ate people. But one day he forged an iron hammer and he fought Oshogan and forced him to leave the country. And after that, the people of Igoro Migoro lionized him, and he's still recognized as a hero even up to this day. As Evian grew old, he was succeeded by his son Ogiamwen to be the next ruler of Igoro Migoro, but the commonality rejected him because the country had, quote unquote, a republican form of government, which he was now trying to change to fit his own selfish needs. So instead of the government having representatives of the people, he was now trying to make the government work exclusively for his interest, and the country people weren't having that. So they rejected his reign, and instead they went up to Ile Ife and Yoruba land to request a new king from the Oni of Ife. Traditions say that this Oni was Oduduwa, who, as we briefly talked about last week, was the founder of Ile Ife. Oduduwa was wary at first of sending one of his children to a foreign land, so he tasked the chiefs who went to his country with the test. He gave them 7 head lice, and he said that these chiefs were supposed to keep them alive for 3 years. One of the chiefs was a man named Oliha, and he kept these lice on the heads of one of his slaves. And for the duration of these 3 years, the lice progressively got bigger and bigger. After the course of 3 years, they returned them to Ile Ife. And after Oduduwa saw that they were responsible for caring for these head lice, he figured that the people of Igoro Migoro were equipped to take care of his son. So he sent his son Oranmion to go to Igoro Migoro and give them a new king. Jacob Ekarevba estimates that Oranmion came to Igoro Migoro around the year 1170. Shortly after his arrival, he married a woman named Erin Winde, and together they had a son named Eweka, and he's the first recognized as the first formal ruler of the second dynasty of Benin, the Oba dynasty. Oba Oranmion frequently found himself getting into political conflict with the people of Igoro Migoro. The chiefs were very accepting of his reign, but the common people weren't. And as we're and as the oral traditions say, a lot of the first kings of the second dynasty spent a lot of time trying to fight civil wars because most of the people were dissatisfied with having a foreigner sit on the throne. So, because of this, Oremion called Igoro Migoro Ile Ibinu, which in Yoruba would translate to land of vexation or a land of anger or land of frustration. And he said that only somebody who was raised in this land and familiar with the customs and culture of it could adequately rule over it. So that's what he had his son do. He had Aweka take over the throne, and then after his son was born, he himself returned to Ife. So we're gonna watch a quick video that explains an alternative account of this origin story, and then after that, we're gonna open it up for our first Q&A.
Your sound is shared as well. Remember, this is the basis of this debate between the only.
Consider going to Pennsylvania, but afraid of the huge price tag attached. Most people don't know this, but almost 100% of homeowners.
I'm sorry, Clyde, go ahead.
That this is where this debate is coming from. Yeah, so make sure it's up on the screen that the video is shared.
Okay.
Hello, my beautiful people. My name is Dr. Cartel. Welcome to another episode of Basic Spanish.
Slides, not the video.
So we spoke about the three different kingdoms, which were.
What's that, Clyde?
We're still seeing your slide, and not the YouTube video.
Oh, you can't see the video?
No, not yet. You got to share. Yeah, share the YouTube tab, the YouTube window.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, my beautiful people. My name is Dr. Cartel. Welcome to another episode of Basic Spanish. Last episode, we spoke about the three different kingdoms, which were Nupe, Junkun, and the Nui people. We finished with the Nui, who had managed to make some expansion into the Benin Kingdom. And I'm sure some of you will be thinking, what is the Benin Kingdom? Well, you're in luck, because this episode we'll be discussing the Benin Kingdom. Let's get started. The Benin Kingdom, also known as the Edo Empire, has its own creation story legend, which was transmitted orally between generations. The little Edo state was originally called Igodo Migodo, and its rulers were referred to as the Ogisio, which means the kings of the sky. Now, the story goes, Prince Ekaladehan, who was the son of the last Ogisio, had a dispute for power with his uncle. He was then banished and fled for his life. We're not sure why, but we know he had to leave Sha. So, anyways, he changed his name to Izodwa, which meant I have chosen a path of prosperity, and traveled to the lands of the Yoruba people, where he eventually became known as Ododuwa, the ruler of Ife. Yes, the name was corrupted. The Yoruba people changed it from Izodua to Ododuwa. Anyways, Obamiyan, who was the grandson or the son of Ododuwa, I don't really know which one, came back to the land of the Edo people and married a beautiful woman called Erimwinde, who was the daughter of the ninth Inogi. Inogi is like a duke. Basically, I'm butchering the pronunciations, but who cares? They had a baby, but Ovamiyan wasn't completely happy where he was. He declared the land Ile Ibinu, which is Yoruba, that means that it is a land of vexation. He said that only someone born and raised with the mysteries of this land could rule it, and left to go back to Ife, leaving his son as the king. His son's name was Eweka, and there's another long story of how the son got the name. Apparently, he couldn't really speak as a boy, so when he eventually spoke, his first word was Owomika, which in Yoruba means my hand has caught it. But the Edo people corrupted it to Eweka. So I don't know if this is true, but this is just part of the legend. He became Eweka the first Oba of Benin. Oba means king. It was Eweka who changed the name of the state from Igodomigodo to Edo, and because his lineage went all the way back to the Ogisio, he was considered a direct descendant of God, so he had divine rights to rule, and therefore all Edo kings after him had divine rights to rule. Now, the Edo kingdom had their own administrative structure. The king was at the top, and the kingdoms were divided up into tribute units or fiefs. A fief holder was responsible for the daily administration of the respective fiefs. The king was assisted in the government by 7 hereditary nobles called Uzama and 2 other groups of non-hereditary nobles. The empire built impressive long walls great thoroughfares, and erected 9 fortified gateways. They had lots of impressive walls that must have taken hundreds of years to build, and tales of the great works in the land of Edo spread to the other lands. It also had a powerful and well-disciplined military. The king was the supreme military commander, but he had generals serving under him, and the military were broken down into well-organized units and subunits. I mean, even the queen, the mother of the empire, had her own personal regiment of soldiers. The actions of the empire show that it was led by very clever leaders and that it was business oriented. It gained money from three main sources: taxes on its waterways, tolls on those who wish to enter the cities to trade, and tributes from the conquered peoples. And trust me, a lot of people wanted to enter the cities to trade after hearing tales of its prosperity and its grandeur and splendor. Craftsmen, artisans, clothes makers, bronze sculptors, carpenters all flocked to the city. The empire soon developed an artistic culture: bronze, ivory, and iron carving, and all kinds of stuff. This led to some of the most beautiful sculptures that we see today, and also explain why the city was so beautiful and so well designed. From 1440 to 1473, Oba Ewuwe, which, by the way, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but if I am, they're saying is the king of goats, meaning he was the goats, the greatest of all time, I think. Or maybe he was just a goat. I don't know. Anyways, Oba Ewuwe the Great. It's actually called Oba the Great. That's so funny. Let me continue. Oba the Great expanded the Edo city into a thriving empire in which Edo was its capital. But the empire came to be known as Ile Ibinu, the Empire of Ile Ibinu, which was the name that Oramiya had already given it. Everywhere was the first of many great conqueror kings. He introduced the annual Igwe festival and set up a political structure that increased the king's authority and set out to conquer even more lands. Their powerful and disciplined military allowed them to continue conquering neighboring peoples, which they then incorporated into the empire. Soon, the empire contained a large mix of diverse ethnicities, from the Istekeri, the Ison, the Ika, the Ijo, to the Yoruba, and of course the Edo people themselves. The empire gained dominance over Midwestern and Western Nigeria, with its borders being the Oyo Empire to the west and the Niger River to the east. Apparently, due to the large mix of ethnicities and the fact that they spoke different dialects, the original name of the empire was corrupted from Ile Ibinu to Ubinu. Then this was further corrupted to Benin City by the Portuguese when they came in the 1450s. Oh, let's talk briefly about the Europeans now. As you know, the Benin Kingdom is on the coast, so it's only natural that they would be the first ones to encounter foreigners traveling.
Positive.
Now, roughly around 1450, the Portuguese.
We don't need to hear about the Portuguese. Not yet. So let's open it up, everybody, to questions that folks may have on this first half of the class. So I have a question right off the bat. Daniel, which side of that argument you think has more historical evidence to back it up?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I personally know that they have. I think that there's a mixture of both stories in there because there's a lot of cultural elements that they have that are similar. Um, for example, as we've seen, Oba Oranmiyan married a woman named Erin Winde, and I'm not sure what her name means in Edo, but in Yoruba, the root word Erin means elephant, and in the Oyo Empire, the elephant is the totem of the Alafin. So obviously, there has to be some connection right there, but I'm personally not sure what it is. I think that there's aspects of truth in both stories. And I also think that there might be some aspects of fiction in both stories. If that answers your question.
It does. And I don't think I wasn't looking for anything definitive, because if we had something definitive, then they wouldn't be arguing the way that they were arguing in 2016. So it hasn't been solved yet. Maybe we need to add some more archaeological evidence to it. Maybe another piece if we find some more tradition from somebody not connected to either one of those kingdoms that can provide some information. Maybe it's there. More archaeology needs to be done, like we always said. Maybe we could find an answer to that. But just wanted to hear your thoughts. Any other questions or comments? Anything in the chat, Daniel? Oh.
Yes, there's 2 hands up, and then there's a question in the chat. Nemnu, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon. So, Aryan actually is the symbol for Obatala or Duduwa. So it's not, it's not specific just to that kingdom. It's really the energy that populated mankind. So if I could go there. And also with these Obas, because a lot of my Oluwo or my elders travel and know these people personally and speak with them and everything. So what I would say is that the controversy over the succession is a struggle, and it's real, because when the dafa or the divination is done, there's a certain amount of will and forcing that can happen. And I can say that what I've been told is that the controversy stems from there's certain items that are secret items that they would not be able to truly possess and touch, because they know they're not the one that was really supposed to be chosen, and which the people say adds to a certain level of issues or misfortune in the region, politically and so on and so forth. So I'm gonna leave it at that for that. But it's more of it's a lot of words in there, roots of the word. Like Ibi is the opposite of Ire, which means blessings, and Ibi, when you're saying vexation, it's more of there are different types of misfortune that you can have. So it was very, very interesting. Thank you. I'm so happy we're covering this class with more so the comment. But there's a lot of images there, like you spoke about Ifa, Clyde. So traditionally, Ifa got its name from the West, which means the indigenous faith of Africa. But really, it's Isheshe, which means traditionalism, African spiritual traditionalism. And there are different types of it. So the picture that we that you showed with, I guess that's actually a depiction of a Rumila providing Dafa, the divination, with the Odus, which are a symbol of the that one there was Ofumeji, which is one of the primary 16, which comprise up to 256, which is a fractal system, the binary system, what computers are based on today, and they all have different energies and resonances and all that stuff. So I'm saying all this to say is that when I asked last week about the aspect of spiritualism, that's where the aspect of it is, that's where it comes from. Like, decisions are made via that aspect in that region, in the Yoruba region, and it's not separate from the culture. It's the culture is rooted around it, the traditionalism. So anyway.
Yes, no, thank you for that. This is why we have the seminars. It's not just about the facilitators sharing the information. Whatever anybody has, give it so that we can all learn from each other. That's what this is about. But yeah, that's a key thing to point out, that in Yoruba land today, you got people that are Christian, you got people that are Muslim, but the base is still those traditional beliefs. And to understand what's going on and to not know who these figures are and how the politics, because these aren't just spiritual figures and not just political figures, it's not just economic figures, it's all of these things combined, which makes it incredibly important to know if you really want to understand. And this history, again, it's a living history. It's not something that's just studying for the past just to say that we know certain names and figures. One other thing I'll mention in terms of the spiritual aspect, every time in the recent past that a new Oba of Benin has come in, one of their primary tasks is to get those sculptures and artworks back from the Europeans that stole them in 1897. And slowly but surely, a lot of those pieces are coming back. And it's not just about having valuable artwork. There are spiritual dimensions to these pieces that need to be brought back into the land. So that's an ongoing challenge. It's continuing. Some things have been returned from Germany and certain universities in the UK, but a lot more needs to be done. So let's keep that pressure going. Another hand, and then we got Robin, who's in live in the audience with his hand, and then Daniel, whatever's in the chat.
Okay, Mr. Francis and then Mr. Thomas.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Just a comment, Dr. Ledbetter. I saw Viola Davis and three of her co-stars on television, I think 2 days ago. And when she mentioned Dahomey, somehow I thought at one time there was a place on the map of Africa known as Dahomey. Is that place still exist, or has its name changed?
The name has changed. It's the Republic of, it's Benin. It's Benin. So just west of Nigeria. If we're looking at this map here, is this country here. Used to be called Dahomey. Now it's the Republic of Benin. This is why I didn't want folks to confuse the Benin that we're talking about now with that, because it's a different place. What we're talking about in class is further to the west, near South Central Nigeria, but the current Republic of Benin was Dahomey, is what they're depicting in that film.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Mr. Thomas and then Robin.
Morning, all. When I look at what's going on in England now, I'm giving me a better sense as to how the empire is built and is still building and how far ahead they're looking. I wonder, why is it we have so many great leaders? And it seems to me that we're trapped looking in the rearview mirror all the time.
Yeah, I think it's, again, it's a problem of the education system that doesn't allow us to know this contemporary information. It keeps us separate from what's going on in Africa today and different places. But then it also doesn't cultivate vision for a lot of African people around the world. What I mean by that is our education systems are the way that they're currently set up and the way that they're presented to young African people, whether they're on the continent or in the diaspora, is get a job and work for somebody else. Get the skills so you can get a job so you work for somebody else, as opposed to training them to cultivate vision of seeing the world different than how it is. When you have an education system that does that uses these past examples and present realities with a orientation to create a new future, then you'll see something different, as opposed to trying to get our young people to conform themselves to present realities just as they are. So I think that's one of the issues and one of the things that we're definitely trying to change in various ways, working with the young people so they can have the tools to build the world that they want, as opposed to fixing themselves into the world that they're already in. Yes,
Thank
sir.
you for that. And we can notice that there seems to be cracks in the empire as we see it now.
Definitely. And hopefully some more folks leave the Commonwealth. Robin, go ahead.
So the folks hear me by speaking this here? Or do I need to speak in their mic?
Okay, yeah, let's give you this. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear? Yeah?
Yeah, I think they could hear you. Mhm.
Oh, did they? You guys can't see this, but so
If you want to come up,
here,
here, you can stand right in front of this chair.
So just started reading this book by Robin Maynard.
Move over a little bit more to the right. Yeah, there you go.
This book by Robin Maynard and Leanne Simpson. It's Robin Maynard is black. Leanne is indigenous. Robin Maynard wrote the book Policing Black Lives. This came out of a series of letters they wrote to each other, but basically they start off by talking about climate change and how it's framed as like, oh, it's caused by human activity. And they're like, human activity. Not all humans equally contributed to that. And then she talks about like going right back to the days of slavery and stuff, what happened there has led us to the situation we are today. So I'm curious about, and she talks specifically about Nigeria. So I'm curious about, in terms of the time frame we're learning about and what was going on then, what, in terms of what was going on then, has led to things like she talks about she specifically, she names like this company, James Bay Company, that's a mining company in the Niger Delta in Nigeria. Right. So I guess and she talks about how so it's part of what was going on back then was the whole plantation thing and the monoculture, right? What that did to the soil and like the in Nigeria, the salinization of the Niger Delta. Right? So the basic question is, in terms of the time period we're learning, in terms of what was going on then, what has contributed to the crises that are like now? As you said, you started the class by saying, let's connect it to what's going on today, right?
So that's interesting. The kingdoms that we're talking about today, let me go back to a map. Let me get on this one. The kingdoms that we're talking about today are we're talking about Edo and the Yoruba kingdoms here. The Niger Delta is here. So you're dealing with the area culturally dominated by the Ijao. During this time period, the folks that lived there were engaged in fishing activities. They weren't a highly centralized people the way we're talking about these kingdoms here. It's a much more democratic area. The people lived off of those waterways. Fast forward to the 1950s and 60s, this is when the oil exploration really begins by Shell, mostly Shell. Then they start destroying the environment. Now, the interesting thing is, all of this happens, the bulk of the oil exploration, because when Nigeria was colonized, the main crop that the British wanted from Nigeria, in addition to forced labor, but they had 10 operations and mining operations, but it was palm oil. But then later on in the 20th century, crude oil gets discovered there. Then it starts to get exploited, and really the exploitation really ramps up right before independence. So you get 1960, Nigeria gets independence. Then 6 years later, you get Biafra. You get the Civil War starts. The Ijao people are here. And when Biafra happens, they're pretty much dominated by the Igbo, who say this is all part of Biafra. So they're much more aligned with the federal government than they were in the Igbo. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on. But anyway, as the 20th century goes on, this place gets more and more polluted. More and more, the Ijao are less able to live the way that they were living before. And you get some heroes that emerge in this struggle against the pollution and the destruction and the lack of, and the other part of this is, although the oil's on the land, they're not benefited equally from it because the capital is in Abuja. So even during the Biafran times, their beef was, we live here, but the Igbo are dominating the Biafra government and are going to benefit off the oil and not us. Then once that situation is over, now the federal government based in Abuja is reaping the benefits of, along with the British and the American companies that are there, off the oil in this region, and the people there aren't. So you get people like Ken Saro-Wiwa, who many people don't know, but he was an activist, used nonviolent protest measures against the government, both the state government as well as the federal government, to try to bring awareness to this. He was actually killed in the 1990s along with some other activists for what he was doing against Shell and against the government for not protecting the people there. So to answer your question, they were engaged in a number of activities, but a lot of them were based off of having that relationship with the land that no longer can be sustainable because of all of the degradation done by Shell and the other oil companies in this region. So that's the best way to answer that. Anything in the chat, Daniel?
Yes. Somebody asked, why would the leaders who reigned in peace during their time be considered as the less or unimportant rulers? Isn't it accepting that perspective is indicative of our colonized mental conditioning and glorifying the peaceful times and doing a deeper dive on those times so they may be repeated and hopefully inspire others to do the same, or have other adopters of the same peaceful practice have similar fame and recognition, perhaps be a better role model to emulate? It feels as if the root cause of the problem is not being addressed, which I propose is basic nasty human behavior. What are your thoughts? You want me to take that, or you want?
I think that's for you, because when you were talking about the leaders, that's one of the things you said. I have an answer to it, but I want to see what yours is.
So I think very bluntly put, people like to glorify certain people and ignore others. I mean, we see that in Africa, we see that in Europe, and we see that in Asia. I mean, even if we just go a couple countries north to Mali, we see that with Mande oral traditions. Sunjata Keita is lionized, but all the people who came after him, they're not really talked about. It's not that they're not important, but in terms of doing things that the Commonwealth would have thought were, I don't want to say productive, but doing things that the Commonwealth would have thought to be noteworthy, they're not necessarily doing that. So I think that's kind of just the human nature thing. We like to put certain people on pedestals. I think that's why the oral histories run that way.
I agree with you, Daniel. That's and the comment that was made in the chat, I'm not sure who made it, but you're correct. As historians, people that study history, when it comes to times of peace and stability, we would love that. But to be quite honest with you, people don't record those times because there's not much to say. It's not exciting. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just not exciting. So people like to record the battles and the conflict and change. It'd be like if you were watching a show and there was no conflict in the show, you would probably stop watching the show pretty quickly. But the funny thing is, you're right. This is what we should be striving for. We should be striving for boring and development along, a stable route and all these things. That's the ultimate goal that we should all be striving for. And even when we look back at African history, we're spending a lot of time talking about these kingdoms because this is where a lot of this history is recorded. But I always, in our classes, like to look at political systems that are more democratic, like the Oromo in Ethiopia. But when you go and actually try to study that history presented, you'll get like, yeah, for 1,000 years, things were good because people had easy ways of solving conflict and ruling themselves. But I can only say that in a sentence. I can't, like if I was going to present a class like that, I'd say, well, that's it. Any questions? We could talk about the political structure. That might take 15 minutes, but then we'd just be sitting there twiddling our thumbs. It's the conflict that drives the, for lack of a better term, juicy and interesting parts of history. And that's sad that that's the case, but that's the case. And we need to fight to make the world boring, I guess. Because if it's boring, then that means that things are good. Boring in a non-fascist way. We don't want people to be bored because they're under somebody's thumb, but boring because everybody's developing and doing different things, and it's peaceful. So I agree with the comment, and that's an explanation as to why that is. Anything else in the chat, Daniel?
There's nothing else in the chat. There is one more hand. Are we going to save that until after the presentation, or?
Is it somebody new?
No.
No, it's just a brief comment.
Oh, go ahead, Miss Anderson. Go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned that I think he was a poet, who was killed because he was an activist.
Ken
Am I
Sorrow Weaver.
correct?
Yes,
Sorrow
yes,
Weaver.
yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I remember the incident very well, and I was so upset with Shell because they were the pressure behind the government,
Mhm.
who did it. And to this day, I will not go in a Shell gas station. I have just decided to boycott them for life.
And I think more of us should take that position because yes, he's the most visible death, but not the only one. Thank you for that. Daniel, go ahead. Back to you.
Okay, so from Jacob Ekarefa, we're going to transition over to Samuel Johnson and what he has to say about Prince Oramion. I think it's just important to note right now, Oba Aweka was a lot of the first Obas of Benin spent a lot of their time fighting civil wars due to political tensions between the upper class and the common folk. Oba Eweka was responsible for creating a cabinet of political officers called the Uzama, a seven-man council who was comprised of representatives of all of the people. After him, there are lots of other kings who spend a lot of their time fighting civil wars, but because that's basically all that they were doing, we're just going to keep it pushing for a little bit. So to get into Yoruba history, Samuel Johnson doesn't give dates like Jacob Ekarevba does. So right now we're kind of on a loose timeline, but to get into it, Samuel Johnson says that Oramion was a prince at Ile Ife and that his reason for leaving the country was a war against quote unquote Mecca. That's how he refers to it in his book. Mecca is implied to mean Muslims. I don't think he was actually fighting against the literal city of Mecca. Some people interpret that to be the Nupe people, but the story goes that the people of Mecca killed his great grandfather, and he led an expedition out of Ile Ife to avenge him and to enact vengeance upon them. So, en route to Mecca, he was followed by a lot of his brothers, but after a petty argument, I believe he said it was over a pot of beer, they started to squabble with each other, and they got so frustrated with each other that they got distracted from the task at hand. So Oramion had to keep it pushing without them. The route to Mecca was blocked from Ile Ife. Johnson says that there was a huge trail of ants that was blocking the way. So Oramion and his military was forced to take another route. He didn't want to return to Ile Ife because that would mean that he was conceding defeat, and that wouldn't be a good look for a king, especially a war general. So instead of returning home, he decides to travel through the land of Borgu, or what the Yoruba people call Ibaraiba. In Borgu, he meets with the chief of the land and asks him where to build a settlement because he's not going to go back home to Ife, but he's going to continue to build new settlements until he gets closer and closer to Mecca. So the chief gives him a talisman, which he ties to a boa constrictor, and he said to follow the snake, and wherever the snake burrows, that's where he was to build a new settlement at. So he ties the talisman to the boa. He follows him for 7 days before he burrows at a hill called Ajaka. Just for perspective, Oyo is around this region right here. Borgu is this area right here. in the dark green. This is just another map of Yoruba land. So Oremion founds Oyo at Ajaka Hill where the snake burrowed. And after the city was built, he left to continue his military campaigns because a lot of the first Alafins of Oyo were inclined to war. There were not a lot of peaceful Alafins at the start of Oyo's foundation. So he couldn't sit still because he was just addicted to fighting. So he established a city and then he left. In his absence, his son Ajaka succeeded him as the second Alafin of Oyo. He was peaceful and non-warlike, and because of that, he was deposed and replaced by his brother Shango, who was more violent in his nature. And Shango, as a lot of people know, is the divinity of thunder and lightning, and Isheshe, or the Yoruba divination system. We'll get to that shortly. So Shango deposes his brother Ajaka for not being warrior enough. At the start of his reign, the Olowu of Owu, that's another Yoruba kingdom, demanded Shango to pay him tribute just as he was able to get his brother Ajaka to do. But Shango refused, and after the Olowu raided his capital, he defeated him in a bloody war. After that, he spent the rest of the 7 years that he was in power making war against a bunch of different people in Yoruba land. He was also remembered in traditions as being a magician. He was said to have the power to summon lightning at his will. And so one day he was giving a show to his courtiers to impress them. And when he summoned lightning down to earth, he accidentally burnt the palace down, killing 160 people, including his wife and his children. And out of embarrassment, the oral traditions say that he committed suicide by hanging himself. After that, he became deified as the Orisha of thunder and lightning. After his death, he was succeeded by his brother Ajaka again, who in the time since his absence became more violent and more brutish in nature. So he continued to follow the model set forth by his brother and his father. After that, we have a bunch of Alafins, some more the oral traditions regard as more important than the rest. So respectively, we have Alafin Aganju, Alafin Kori, Oluwasu, Onikbogi, Ofiren, Igu, Guoju, and Orompoto. Alafin Aganju is known for adding piazzas or public marketplaces to the royal palace. So he was known for being an architect and for making architectural improvements to the kingdom. So he added these little public spaces shown in this illustration. Alafin Oluwasu began the practice of building kobis. So what those are is on the royal palaces in Oyo. There were traditionally these tall cone pyramid-like structures. That was a practice began during his reign to make the buildings appear more intimidating and more imposing. This is just a picture of those in real time. Alafin Ofinran was the person responsible for introducing Ifa or Isheshe into Yoruba land. The traditions say that this was when the Igungun cult was first practiced in Yoruba land. This is what he's known for. Then we get to Alafin Orompoto. In Oyo, Alafin Orompoto is remembered as a man, but in other parts of Yoruba land, Alafin Orompoto was said to be a woman. I'm not sure which traditions are correct. I would just say that since Orompoto was from Oyo, I'm more inclined to believe what they had to say about their own ruler. But Orompoto was said to have made major contributions to building up Oyo's military. Prior to this point, Oyo was a very small and unimportant state. It was very important to the Yoruba people, but in terms of politics and economics, Oyo was not all too significant. But Orompoto started the practice of building up the military and giving Oyo a cavalry of 1,000 horsemen and 1,000 foot soldiers. And what's important about this is Oyo's geographical position in Nigeria. Most of Yoruba land is situated in the rainforest. And if you know anything about geography, it's very difficult to keep animals such as cattle and horses and sheep and goats in the jungle because of the tsetse fly. They carry lots of dangerous diseases such as malaria, which can kill certain types of farm animals. So south of Oyo, it would have been very difficult to raise animals such as horses to build a military in this way. But since Oyo is in the north of Yoruba land, where it's not jungle, but it's rather savanna and grassland, that was a very strategic move on Orompodo's part. So this is Oyo right here. This is the area where it would have been mostly grassland. South of here is very dense jungle and rainforest, just to give you a visual. After Orompodo, there were a bunch of other Alafines who traditions remember by name, but also don't regard as that important. So to continue to Benin and Jacob Ekerevba, the most important Oba was Oba Iwuwar. He was the person who took Benin from being a state to being an empire. And as was briefly mentioned in the first video we watched in class, he was the first of a long line of warrior kings. So just as Oranmion was a warrior king in Oyo, so was Oba Iwuwar a warrior king in Benin. So the story is that his father was Oba Ohen, who Ekereba says reigned from around 1334 to 1370. He had four sons who all succeeded him in chronologically. So the first was Egbeka, then was Orobiru, then was Uwaifiokun, and then there was Prince Ogun. So during the reign of his second son Orobiru, Uwaifiokun and Ogun, as the youngest sons of Ohen, were banished from the kingdom. We're not told why. All we are told is that they were exiled. And so after the death of Oba Orobiru, Prince Ogun sent his brother Uwaifiokun back to Benin to ask the elders if he had their consent to go back to their country of birth. And if you remember from our last Shiro's class, we talked about a woman in Benin named Imotan, who was remembered for being the first person to start a daycare in Benin to take care of children. And she was also responsible for giving Prince Ogun shelter in Benin while he was in exile. So Ekharevba only talks about her in passing, but she's also a very important person at that time, just to connect it to a previous class. So when Uwaifiokun gets to Benin, he lies to the elders and says that he hadn't seen his brother Ogun since they were last exiled from the country. So he illegitimately usurps the throne and takes his place as Oba of Benin. And after catching word of this, Prince Ogun makes regular trips to sneak in and out of the country at nighttime. Eventually, he manages to kill his brother in his sleep and then usurp the throne and become the rightful heir of Benin. Upon becoming king, he changes his name from Ogun to Iwuwar, which in Edo means it is cool. According to Jacob Ekerevba, Oba Iwuwar was a great physician and traveler. He traveled over every part of Nigeria, Dahomey, Ghana, Guinea, and the Congo. He was a military expansionist. It was traditions remember him as having conquered 201 towns and villages across Yoruba land and Igbo land. The walls of Benin, which we're going to talk about in a second, were finished in his reign. And it was during his reign that Igoro was named Edo. While he was sneaking in and out of the country when his brother was still in power, part of the reason that he was able to avoid getting caught, in addition to Imotan, was a slave named Edo, who would give him refuge in his master's house at nighttime. And It was because of this that when he became king, he was so appreciative of Edo, who he regarded as his best friend, that he named the country after him. So Edo, according to the oral traditions, was the name of a slave who gave Prince Ogun refuge while he was still in exile. So Oba Iwuar was remembered in the traditions for making several innovations. He assembled the Ekhevbo in Ur, which were the state councilors. He introduced the practice of wearing red ododo cloth, which is only worn by the nobility. He initiated the practice of wearing royal beads. He developed a flute called the aziken. He encouraged the art of ivory carving. So while that was a practice that had been established since the Ogiso dynasty, it was under his reign that this was starting to become an art that was heavily patronized by the state. He introduced the cult of Ogiuwu, who in Benin was the god of death. While most of the divinities in Benin had sacrifices made to them in animals, Ogiuwu was the only divinity who was exclusively fed humans in his offerings. He also made a bunch of public ceremonies for the king, the Igwe ceremony, a bunch of local ceremonies. So he's remembered as being a very important person in Benin. So just to give you a visual, this is the red adodo cloth that he was responsible for developing in his reign. These are some more of the beads that he introduced wearing in his time. This is just some more pictures. To give you an example of the ivory that was being carved at this time, this is the type of art that Oba Iwuar was patronizing. So we have leopard sculptures, we have ivory armlets that would have been worn by the nobility, we have salt shakers. So Benin had a very rich artistic culture, and this was the type of environment that he was facilitating during his time. So to get to the walls of Benin, fortified and walled cities are very common in West Africa, especially in Yoruba land and Hausa land. According to Jacob Ekareba's chronology, they were began during the reign of Oba Ugwola, who reigned from around 1280 to 1295, and it was Oba Iwuar who finished them. So these walls were excavated during the 1960s by a British archaeologist named Graham Kona. He found that the city was surrounded by 3 earthen walls. The capital of Benin City was surrounded by a small wall. Outside of that was a bigger wall. And then outside of that was an even bigger wall, which was dated to be the oldest and most ancient of them. So they were built inwards instead of outwards. He radiocarbon dated these to around 1340 CE with a margin of error of 150 years. So that basically means that at the earliest, these could have been 1240 CE, and at the absolute latest, these could have been 1440 CE. He estimates that these walls would have either been built over the course of several seasons by a small working force or by one large working force of 5,000 workers who were working continuously for 10 hours a day. He's more likely to believe that this was built over the course of several seasons. He doesn't believe that a large working force would have been that feasible in the environment, but that's just his own personal interpretation. And so to close this up, we're going to watch one more video about Benin. These are about the walls of Benin, and then after that, we will go ahead and open it up for our last Q&A.
All right, so really quick before I get into the video.
Can we see the video or is it still on the slides?
Well, on the slides. No.
All right, so really quickly before I get into the video, I have to make this clear. These are not images of the Benin earthworks. This is an image of a Fulani village. This is an image of Simbozerero. This is concept art of Baghdad in the 9th century, I think. And this is an image of a Thai moat. Walls have historically been the most straightforward and yet generally effective way to keep out who you want kept out and in who you want in. As a
We
result,
can't see.
such defensive fortifications were used across the world.
We're not able to see the video.
It's just buffering on your name.
I can see it
Um,
on our end.
I can see it.
Let me try to stop the share and then put it back up. Are you able to see it now?
yes.
Yes.
Okay.
West Africa included. And out of all the walls in West Africa, no, probably the world, those of Benin are among the greatest. In this video, I'm going to outline the Benin walls, their history, and the debate surrounding them. Throughout our history, the wall has been a standard feature for West African cities of multiple different cultures. Of these, the walls of Benin are probably the most famous, yet these structures aren't actually walls. The cult walls of Benin are better described not as walls, but as a network of ramparts, ditches, or earthworks locally called iya. Archaeological work in the 70s and 80s shows the total length of these iya exceeded 16,000 kilometers or 10,000 miles, all within a region of 6,500 square kilometers or 2,500 square miles. Now, while I hate making comparisons like this, in order to give an idea of the scale of the Benin earthworks, the Ming Wall, often referred to in discussion of the Great Wall of China, was about 9,000 kilometers, while the total Great Wall length was about 21,000 kilometers. So, as you can see, the Benin earthworks were larger than the Ming Wall, and while shorter than the total Great Wall's length, were not too far off. This video is going to focus on the earthworks found around Benin City. These iya are traditionally split into a third, second, and first wall, but I'm going to call them the outer, middle, and inner regions respectively. I'm going to focus on the middle and inner regions here because, unlike the outer region, these two form a single enclosure. The Benin City iya were dump ramparts, ditches with soil deposits that form ramparts which would slope at their natural angles of rest. Not accounting for erosion, by the time of a survey in the 60s, most of the outer iya were less than 7.6 meters or 25 feet tall from rampart top to ditch bottom, while the inner iya, about 11.6 kilometers or 7 miles in circumference, were usually over 15 meters or 50 feet deep. The inner earthwork had 9 wood gates that would have been under constant guard watch, and that would have functioned as toll booths. It was also reinforced by vegetation, and by the time European travelers arrived at Benin, it was filled with massive trees, and the inner rampart also could have had thorny bushes. It's possible that the inner iya featured wooden reinforcements, which would have made the ramparts into a flatter shape more recognizable to us as a wall, but this is debated. The idea of wooden reinforcements mostly comes from an illustration by the Dutch physician Alfred Dapper, which depicts a mud wall assumed to be the inner iya, being reinforced by crisscrossing wooden planks. Whether or not it's even valid to associate the depicted wall and the inner earthwork is debatable, and it's also noteworthy that Dapper never actually visited Benin, instead probably relying on another person's account. If wood was used, all evidence of it eroded and decomposed a long time ago, but it's possible. It's more likely that wood was used to ramify and prop up gate areas. By who, when, and why were these works built? As I hope I've already shown, we don't actually know a lot about the Benin iya, and their purpose and dates of construction are still being debated. Traditionally, the inner earthwork was built under Emperor or Oba Eware in 15th century, while the outer earthworks under King Agula in the 13th century to protect from the attacks of enemy powers like Udo. This interpretation argues for military origins of Benin's wall, and it's backed by Benin's oral tradition, which, while having contrary accounts, consistently says the iya were meant for defense, and also by Eware's inner earthwork. Because of intense vegetation, climbing these inner iya would have been difficult, and the defending army would have also had an artificial high ground advantage. As Oserheim Osedolor says in his thesis, Military System of the Benin Kingdom, circa 1440 through 1897, at the time the construction of the earthwork began, Benin had no well-organized and heavily equipped army. Strategic thought was therefore focused on the best kind of fortification which will make it difficult for sustainable siege by the enemy. This is just one school of thought, though, and tradition has been opposed by scholars. Graham Kona, who isn't fully against tradition, argues that only the inner earthworks built or, according to some historians, steepened by Aware likely had military purposes. Kona instead argues that, aside from Aware's inner, probably defenses, the Benin earthworks were actually village enclosures who owed allegiance to a central authority that merged to create a single urban unit by the time Aware came up. Kona's idea kind of reflects a popular idea for the origins of Benin City, that it was a fusion of agricultural communities who used their enclosures as farmland borders, but not military defense. The idea has some support. For example, the non-inner ditches are relatively shallow, a fact that might support the idea that their purpose was not actually military. That said, it's important to keep in mind that this doesn't mean the outer earthworks couldn't have still been defenses, just that defense wasn't their focus. Then there's Patrick Darling's theory, which strongly opposes tradition. Darling argues that the Benin earthworks were built during a pre-dynastic period before the Obas, the dynasty that Agula and Aware belonged to, became of significant power. Instead, he says they were built by a bunch of preceding groups that the Ogas conquered. Darling basically says that the oral tradition was Oba propaganda, meant to legitimize their reigns over the region. For evidence of non-military earthwork purposes, Darling made a sequence of agricultural border earthwork construction that resulted in Benin cities yet, and points towards the fact that lots of outer settlements have earthworks, most deep when running alongside neighbors. An observation, he says, indicates property-driven reason behind their construction and not military reason. Now, I'm not going to take any stance on this. Many of these theories rely on heavy assumptions, as many historical theories do, and there isn't enough evidence to really back any of these conclusively, so I don't think that we should rest to any sort of decisive, this is the correct theory. That said, there is decent evidence to back the idea that Benin's inner earthworks were military and built under a powerful dynasty. They would have needed a calculated 5,000 workers working 10 hours a day, 7 days a week to be finished in one dry season, or about 9 months. These calculations also measured digging time, not including the amount of time needed to actually deposit mud, increases in time required to move around as ditches got deeper, or time needed for clearance. Just being able to mobilize this workforce would have probably required some sort of considerable power in the region. Archaeologists have also proven that at least parts of the inner earthworks were built over pre-existing buildings, which, using charcoal samples, were probably up during the 14th to 15th centuries. This points towards the inner Iya following some sort of master plan that shows intentional creation, which again might point towards some sort of political power in the region. Again, though, this is all hypothetical. Right now, a lack of more detailed oral history, available writings, and datable archaeological evidence means we can't really make a chronology, so we don't really know enough to say what order the earthworks were built in. It's possible we'll never get answers to these questions. Aside from the destruction caused by the 1897 British invasion, new construction projects in Nigeria continue to result in Iya destruction, while many local residents seem more content to use their ditches as garbage disposal than to preserve them. People just often don't respect archaeological sites. Hopefully, we'll be able to do more work to reveal whatever information there may be left hidden within these and other earthworks in Africa, before they are destroyed and their legacy forgotten.
Thank you for
so
that.
That's it from my presentation. So, Clyde, I'm going to turn it back to you.
All right, so we're going to end up for today, but a lot of important information. Like I mentioned, I'll share with you all the course website this afternoon, where you'll be able to find resources on this. And then going back to the, just to kind of wrap things up. So with the traditional belief that those walls were built by Oba Eware the First, the current Oba right now in Benin, and you can follow all the. It's amazing how this all connects because you can follow all these people on social media, and their offices on social media. So if you want to take the information that you learned today and see what's going on in contemporary times, it's just a Google search away. Particularly, the owner of IFA is very popular on Instagram. You can follow him in the things that he does. And I think earlier this year, Oba Iware II, who named himself after Iware I, who built those walls, he just had quadruplets with one of his wives, and he's relatively older now. So the fact that he had quadruplets, I think 3 boys and a girl, earlier, shows that he's still still very much the king, and still very doing his thing with his wives. So this is living history. These people hold offices that go back at least 1,000 years. So don't look at this history as just a dead past. This is a living history. These are traditions. These are African traditions. You don't have to follow the Windsors. You can follow these folks if you want to, have some royalty to look at. So we'll stop there today. Next week, we are moving further east, and we will talk about Igbo land. So we're kind of making a counterclockwise rotation around Nigerian history. So we're going to be talking about Igbo land, the southeast, political formations, cultural formations, what was going on during this time period. The Nri Kingdom was mentioned in one of the videos. We'll talk about that. So stick with us. Check out the course website, and we will go from there. So if there's any questions, keep them. We'll turn off the recording, and we'll now open it up for open discussion. So thank you all, and we'll talk soon. All right. Any questions? Anything in the chat, Daniel, or any